Welcome everybody to episode 13 of Ansible 101. And my voice might be a little bit not wonderful today. Hopefully that's okay with you. It's working enough that I think we can get through this hour. I was very close to not having the live stream today because my health had somewhat of a dive last Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday was finally kind of a turnaround day. But I was pretty close to going to the hospital over the weekend and was making plans for, I could be there for a while, because that's the way it is sometimes with Crohn's disease. Luckily, that didn't happen. I didn't test positive for the disease that shall not be named, so that was another good thing. And now I'm back with you today to talk about collections. Let's see, let me go over to, where is it? Let me go over to the screen here. And first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much to everybody who's sponsoring me on GitHub and Patreon. One of the things that has been so amazing to see for me is I have a job and a situation with open source work where I can kind of work at different times of the day, which is great for me because I have Crohn's disease, and sometimes it can cause you to have issues at different times of day, and so you can't do the work that I can't work at normal hours sometimes. And so I've never really been able to hold a job that would require me to be sitting in a desk from 9 to 5 or something like that. So your support is able to help me do these things. So thank you very much to some of the new GitHub sponsors like Chris Conmey, Zach Biles, Gary Mansell, Bara Azken, I'm terrible with names, Parag Magunya, and John and Maxim from on Patreon. And if you want to sponsor me, there are links down in the description to do that. My goal is to be able to get enough income from open source work that I can basically do a lot more of these videos and educational efforts, and be able to give a lot more resources to people who want to learn about technologies like Ansible, Kubernetes, and all of the associated DevOps tools. There are a couple things from last week's episode. You might notice that I'm wearing a very bright red shirt today. Solomon from, I'm guessing, who lives in Chicago, said, we don't like St. Louis from where I'm from. So today I have my St. Louis Cardinals shirt on. If you don't follow baseball, you might not know much about it, but the Cardinals and the Cubs have always had a historically great rivalry. But the thing is that the Cardinals are better. So it's not really, it doesn't matter if you don't like us. We are the better team, even if you have won the World Series more recently than us. Anyways, Handel Bard also says systems that he used to work on decades ago when clustering was being rolled out, there were failures in the cluster that caused more outages than if a single server with manual failover had been implemented. And that was talking to my point last week about the fact that sometimes when you build systems to be more resilient and more fault tolerant and high availability and all these amazing buzzwords that you might also sign up for extra support contracts and things to make happen, sometimes that system is so complex that it's harder to run and results in more outages than if you had a simple system. And so I usually try to make sure that I'm not doing something complicated. In fact, I'll give you a preview. I have a new chapter for Ansible for DevOps, the book. This is going to be the new chapter 7, which I hate doing this because now I have a new chapter 7, so I had to go back into all the chapters 7 and beyond and bump them and also change all the references in the book to other chapters. And that means that some of the previous episodes where I talk about chapter 10 being about security, well, now it's chapter 11. So I did that, though, to maintain consistency in the book. But at the end of this chapter, I have a quote, "Clarity is better than cleverness," from Eric Raymond. Here, I'll hold that up. And the camera, of course, there it goes. The camera focused on it. That's great. Anyway, clarity is better than cleverness. I like simplicity in my programming and in my code and infrastructure, just because otherwise, when things get too complex, we're humans after all, and humans we don't have the ability to go so deep into complexity. Even if we build AI and machine learning to try to understand that complexity, we are human operators who have to deal with these things, and if it gets too complicated, it can be really hard. anyways, I liked that that mention, and I think anybody that works with systems long enough knows you don't introduce complexity unless it's necessary. At least you shouldn't. Someone, Geerling, also asked if I've considered using a next unit of computing, an NUC or NUC, for Kubernetes clusters instead of pies. Yes, I build Kubernetes clusters out of many different types of equipment, and I'm going to get to that in a future episode of my Turing Pi cluster series. Why would you build a cluster of pies when it's slower and in some ways less energy efficient per unit of computing? In terms of CPU and memory and I/O speed and things. Why would you want to do it out of pies instead of something that's faster and more cool and hip and such? I'll get to that, but the bottom line is that it's more fun and interesting to do it with the resource constraints, in my opinion, than to do it with a vanilla machine or VMs and things like that. Anyways, although that goes a little bit counter to my previous statement that you want to reduce complexity. Using slower machines that are not necessarily as capable to do something might not be as simple as using one computer to build a cluster or something like that. And then Ilari asks, will you speak about Ansible Container? I will speak about it. Basically, that is a dead project that I would not recommend touching. There are other ways to build and maintain Docker images using Ansible, or Podman images, or whatever kind of container images you want. Ansible Container was an early attempt to see how could we manage containers with Ansible, and it was also somewhat a failed attempt. It didn't really have a lot of uptake, and the maintenance kind of died out a year or two ago at least. Might have been 2017 or something, I don't know. It's been a long time since it's really been used. Anyways, if you want to put where you're from in the chat, it's always cool to see where everyone is around the world. I noticed somebody mentioned earlier that it's chilly in South Africa. I would take that. It's been hot and humid here in St. Louis. It feels like a swamp when you go outside. There was one day last week that was actually pretty nice, but I would like a couple chilly days where I could put on a jacket. And thank you very much, Hans, for the little super chat donation thingy. Someday I might build some Ansible automation to do something when there's a super chat in my office. That would be kind of cool. And yeah, Yorkshire's too warm. Yeah, Saudi Arabia might be a little bit hot right now too as well. I've never been to the Middle East, but I would like to visit. There's plenty of places there that we read about in our kids' geography class that now I am, like Jordan in particular, that I'd love to see and explore. Anyways, that is not what this episode is about. This is about Ansible Collections. And a couple episodes ago, we talked about Ansible Galaxy and Ansible Roles. And collections have some heritage from there. And I've this new chapter of the book, you are the first people in the world to see this because it is not part of the book yet. I'm still editing it, and I'm still adding the last section talking more about Galaxy dependencies and collections and things like that. So that I was hoping to have that done by this morning, but like I said, I was sick, and when you're sick, things are a little slower to progress. Like all of the different projects I'm working on right now, they all kind of took a nosedive this past weekend. Anyway, Ansible roles can help you organize like Ansible code, Ansible tasks, and handlers and variables and things like that, but they weren't ever very good at letting you organize Ansible modules and plugins, basically the Python content that you can use to extend Ansible's behaviors. So a few years ago, I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself here because in the chapter that I wrote, this is actually not the first part, but let me get to that part just so that I have my notes. A few years back, this was probably 2016 or 2017. 2017 or so, people started saying like, how do I share my custom modules with other playbooks, and how do I share them if I want to contribute a module, but I don't necessarily want to go through the work of getting it into Ansible core, which already in 2016, 2017, we were seeing problems with the ability to maintain all of Ansible's, at that time, hundreds. I don't remember when it switched to thousands, but that might have been 2017. The number of modules in Ansible core had just ballooned. So some people were like, I want to have some modules that I put out there and maintain, but I don't want to go through the process of getting them in core. I don't want to maintain them in core. It takes a long time to get my fixes merged into core. So at that time, we started exploring different ways of distributing modules and plugins and other things besides just roles on Ansible Galaxy. And the first attempt at that was building this tool called Mazer. And Mazer, this is something you won't really need to know if you're using collections, but it's good to know the background. Mazer was just an early attempt to see what can we do with what we have at that time, which was a couple years ago. I think Ansible 2.7 might have been the first time that Mazer started to do anything useful. And then 2.8 was when Mazer could actually interact with Ansible and with Galaxy and put things onto Galaxy that were not just roles. And Mazer lets you put what it was calling a collection of Ansible content together. And that collection could have roles and plugins and modules at that time. And long term, it was also envisioned that it would have playbooks. So you could have like a whole, if you had a project for Ansible, you could put basically the whole project into a collection, and the collection could be distributed on Ansible Galaxy or at some point in the future in a private Ansible Galaxy that you maintain. So Mazer was an early attempt, and it was just kind of experimental, trying to figure out how is this all going to work? How are we going to put things together? Also, how do we improve on Galaxy's ability to have versioning, semantic versioning, and updates and upgrades? And it had an idea of a lock file that lets you, you could specify different version constraints, and then the lock file would give you a specific version when you install. So some of these things actually made it into Ansible Core. Other parts of it are still not in Ansible Core, but maybe someday. But if you want to look at the history of it, this repository has some of that history in it. And I also thought it was interesting and cool because it was another Ender's Game reference. Mazer Rackham was one of the characters who kind of helped figure out how to defeat the buggers in the book. So anyway, if you've ever read the book, he's an interesting character, I guess, at least. But I thought it was also funny that in the description it said, a Mazer is also a hardwood drinking vessel. It's like, just throw that in there for extra kicks, I guess. Anyway, so that's Mazer. It was the first attempt to figure out what to do. And in the meantime, it was obvious from anybody that looked at Ansible's community that things were problematic with the way that Ansible is maintained, Ansible Core itself, and the way that modules and contributions to Ansible were handled, because over time, as more and more companies started using Ansible and more people started using Ansible, and it became literally one of the most popular open source projects on the planet, and definitely on GitHub, the backlog of issues started to go way up. And part of the problem was that now, instead of just having a few hundred Linux-based modules, you had a few hundred Linux-based modules, a few hundred modules for certain applications, a few, I don't know how many thousand modules for networking appliances and devices, hundreds of modules for Windows were added, hundreds of modules for security things were added. And so all of a sudden we had, I don't know what it was with 2.9, but like something like 3,000 or 4,000 modules. And the core team didn't expand as much as this backlog started expanding. So the problem was with any, I mean, we've seen it with the pandemic. If your R0 is above 1, the backlog will just keep increasing exponentially, or at least increasing at some rate. If it's below 1, then you will be able to whittle this down and get it back down to 0. But that has not happened for three and a half years now. So this blog post is by Greg Sutcliffe, who's a data analyst for Ansible and works at Red Hat. And he has a lot of other good posts talking about how we can measure sustainability in our growth. And I've talked with him a bit in the past about this. And he has a Twitter feed too, Greg, I forget his name on Twitter. I think it's linked somewhere on here. Anyways, you can look him up, Greg Sutcliffe. But he has a lot of good work on how can we measure this, and how are we going to measure this now that we have done some things to change this track and make it better. How are we going to see if we're making it better or if it's actually getting worse over time? And so he's trying to set up data to help support that and show like maybe some of these new things that we've done, we need to change course on them or shift how we think about it. And what was done is the Ansible team looked at the idea of collections, which was something that was already kind of becoming a thing. And then they also looked at how can we take Ansible's core development, which has one cool feature of having everything under the sun included in Ansible core. How can we make that more sustainable? Because having every single module in the world in one GitHub repository with one team managing it, even though that they had built some tools to make it so some modules could be approved by other people and all that, it just became super complicated. And that's not really the way that the world works with GitHub and with open source development cycles. So the idea was we can break things out and take modules that are related. Like there's no reason to have a networking module for a Cisco device, which requires some specialty to use, and you probably aren't going to use it if you're, let's say, a PHP developer. But a PHP developer wants a composer module to help them manage their PHP dependencies. There's no reason to have both of those two modules in the same GitHub repository using the same development workflow and the same team managing them. So instead of that, all of these different modules were pulled out of Ansible core, and this was actually done very recently, I think a month or so ago, was when maybe 2 months now, was when all these modules were pulled out into separate content collections. And so there's a networking collection, and there's a general community collection, and there's a Kubernetes collection, which I happen to maintain. And there's all kinds of collections that have all the different kind of content. And the idea is that over time, we're going to try to get these collections of modules and plugins to be maintained by the groups of people that actually use them. So instead of having one person who's not an expert in PHP and Cisco networking switches, that person, if they are an expert in Linux POSIX environment, they could manage that POSIX collection instead of having to manage everything else. So this is the big thing that's happening with Ansible 2.10. The good thing on the back end for those of us, if you've been following along this series, you've noticed we haven't really talked about collections much. If you're going to install Ansible like we did earlier in the series using pip install Ansible or pip3 install Ansible, you're going to get the same thing. It's not going to be different in Ansible 2.10. You're going to still have all the same modules in that distribution, but all those modules are going to be coming from all these collections, and they're going to be managed separately. So that, for example, with the Kubernetes collection, since I have some expertise in Kubernetes, I've been able to merge some things like a new Helm module that were sitting in the issue queue for Ansible itself, probably for a year now. We put that into the Kubernetes collection, so now that's in there and you can start using it now. That couldn't have happened if we continued down the path of having thousands of modules in Ansible core. So long term, that's probably going to cause a few speed bumps here and there. And I would encourage you to test anything on Ansible 2.10 before you just blindly update to it and start running your playbooks with it. But it's going to be a good thing for the overall ecosystem, because it was not sustainable to continue having the backlog increase by hundreds of issues a month indefinitely. That's not good for anybody to have that happen. And it's a good problem to have that you have so much interest, but it's also not going to help anyone long term to have that continue. So it was necessary, and it was the hard thing was that because it was becoming such a big issue to have all these modules in Ansible core, it was kind of done a little quicker than I think is ideal to get everything out and start moving to these new things. So we're still, I think as a community, as the Ansible community, we're still dealing with how this new world is working together. It's a little bit like changing your tires. What is it? Change tire while car driving. It's a little bit like this video here, which I'll mute so that I don't get demonetized. But while the car's driving, we're changing the tire. It's not ideal. That's probably not the best way to change a car's tire, but it can be done. And it, as this video highlights, it's probably not the safest thing in the world, but it can be done, and it kind of has to be unless we wanted to just stop the car, which we don't want to do. We don't want to stop innovating and making automation better. So anyway, that is the history of Ansible collections. And to show how collections actually work, I'm going to create a plugin, which we have not done yet. We've been using plugins and we've been using modules quite a bit in Ansible. But for illustration purposes, I'm going to create a filter, or not a test plugin. A filter plugin is also pretty easy, but test plugins are one of the easiest plugins to create and manage in Ansible, and they don't technically require much documentation, so it's easier to document and demonstrate how they work. So I have this playbook main.yaml right here, and I'm going to let's say it's a front-end web development playbook that generates a web page, and you have to choose a color for this web page. And so when you choose a color, you want to make sure that that color is a certain form of let's say, blue in this instance, because blue is my favorite color. So I'm going to say vars my color choice blue. And that's what I'm going to choose. You could have a red page or a pink page or an orange page or something like that. But I'm going to make a task. And since my company's marketing team says, no, we really want to make sure that it's a form of blue and not red or pink or something else, I'm going to verify that my color choice is a form of blue. And we want to assert that. And we've used assert before just to make an assertion about our code. It's kind of an inline test in Ansible. And what we could do here is say that we could say assert that my color choice is blue. And that would be a very simple way to do this. And I think that's going to work. Let me remember that I have not tested as much of this because I've been sick. So we'll see if all these assumptions work. Let's see, Ansible playbook main.yaml. That's this playbook, and I'm going to use the local connection because this isn't actually operating on anything. It's just using an assertion. So it's -c local to use a local connection to my computer, and I'm going to give it a inventory of localhost. This is kind of a hack in case if you ever want to run a playbook against localhost, you can just throw it this, and it will do that. A little hack for you to keep in mind. I don't remember why the comma is necessary. Maybe it's not anymore. Let's see. My color choice is blue. Oh, this has to be a token. So like that, I believe. Name got string. If blue. Wait a second. Maybe we do equals. Okay, there we go. So my color choice is blue. The problem here is that this is a web dev thing. My favorite color is not red, Doug, unfortunately. Red is a good color, although if you're on video, it's often a bad color for that because it oversaturates the red channel. As you can see here, it's kind of orangish over here, reddish over here. Part of that is the color temperature of the lights in my office. But anyways, blue is my favorite color. And probably not this color blue, though. This is like that garish, true, full blue. I like more of a navy blue. Not quite navy blue, but like between that and this. Anyways, besides the point completely, this is a little bit naive because what if we say, what's another way to express blue? We'll say OOOOFF, and that is another way to express blue. So if we run this now, it's going to say this. It's going to say it failed, but this is perfectly valid if you're talking about the web and you're trying to describe the color blue. So we could say, okay, we could say that my color choice equals blue, or my color choice equals this. All right, so that would work. But now we get some hip developer who knows all about shortening these things up. You don't have to have, if it's a color like this, you can basically chop each one of these in half and you can say OOF. So that's actually another way to represent blue. And it's going to fail. So I can keep doing this and put or it equals OOF and do that. The problem is whenever you start doing this, I think I've mentioned this before in one of the live streams, if I start seeing programming in my Ansible playbooks, that's a sign that it's a good time to start thinking about writing a custom module or a custom plugin or something like that to deal with this situation. Because we don't want our playbooks to turn into logic. That's not, a lot of people are like, Ansible's horrible, it's programming in YAML. It's like, well, if you're doing that, in my opinion, you're doing something wrong.
And you should probably fix that by taking the programming out of the YAML and putting it into where it should be, which is a programming language like Python. So what we can do is we can write a test plugin for this. So what we can say instead of all this is say that my color choice is blue. And then we can write a test plugin that called blue, and that blue test plugin is going to take all of the different possibilities and allow us to just write this instead, which makes our playbook a lot simpler. And when someone comes up and looks at this, they're not going to think, oh man, he's doing a lot of programming in this playbook. They're going to think, oh, this is really simple. Like, they're just making sure that before we start building this web page out of the color blue, they're going to make sure that it's actually blue. So to make that plugin, there's a lot of different ways that you can write plugins and modules to hook into Ansible and extend its. Somebody says blue dabba-dee dabba-doo. Now that song is going to be stuck in my head the rest of the day, from Eiffel 65. There's a lot of different types of ways you can extend Ansible with plugins, and the simplest way in a playbook to add a plugin is just make a directory for it. So I'm going to make a directory called test plugins, and it's the same thing for any other kind of plugin. So there's filters like Jinja filters, like you could say like this is a filter int. You could make a Jinja filter, and those would go into a folder called filter plugins. For modules, those are the weird one where I think you put those in a library folder. And the documentation for all this is on Ansible documentation, writing plugins, something like that. I don't know, and just developing plugins. So you can find all the documentation about all this here. We're going to make a test plugin. So we're going to do that here, but up towards the top, it tells you where to put plugins so that your playbook can see them, and it gives you notes on all the different types of plugins. Test plugins are one of the simplest, and that's why I'm choosing it here, because we can actually fit it in an episode. So I created this folder for it, and I'm going to create a new file called blue.py. And it's a Python file. Now, you don't have to call it blue.py. You can call it anything, and Ansible will load it, and it'll load all the tests inside of it. I like to have my plugins all be in separate files, though, and named by what's inside of them. If you look at Ansible's core test plugins, you'll notice that they're all kind of lumped together. If I go to Ansible/Ansible, it's under, what is it? LibAnsible, maybe? Plugins, test. Yeah, so Ansible has a few here. And what Ansible's structure does is most of them, so these are all different definitions for just functions that Ansible will map to different plugins. You can see here that it has a class test module. This is the important part, that returns a map of tests. So Ansible, when it looks up what test modules are available to it, it looks for any test module classes in any files in this folder, and then it's going to call the test function. I call it a function, but in Python sometimes they're called something else besides a function. Anyways, it calls this method on the test module class, and then you return a map of, this is the name of the plugin, and then this is what it's going to call. It's going to call this function. So in this case, failed, which is up here, defined on line 35, failed. So it's going to call this, and then this is going to return whether it's true or false, this particular test. So we're going to do the same thing in this file. And you can see that Ansible's code follows a certain syntax. I believe that they use Flake 8, which is a Python standard, to lint their code. So this is all like kind of compatible with that standard way of writing Python. And there's also there's a few PEP standards that are used for writing Ansible code. Our little test plugin is going to be pretty darn simple, so we don't need to worry about too much all of that linting and how it's written and stuff. But I do like to start my custom plugins just with one line introduction of what is this doing, so that when I come back to it later, I can see like, what is this supposed to be doing? So I'm going to say Ansible custom blue test plugin definition. That's what's going to be in this file. And then I'm going to do two different things. One is I'm going to define, have a method that is going to return whether or not a given string is blue. So I'm going to say is blue string. This is going to be the method. This is going to be the method that is called whenever you call the isBlue plugin. This should also be 4 spaces. So let me change my tab width here. And then the next thing is, as I said, you need to have a test module, where is it? Test module class right here with a test method that returns the mapping. So I'm just going to copy this out of Ansible's core and say this is going to be Ansible blue test. And the test module is going to return a list of tests, return, and it's going to just be 1, which is going to be blue. So this right here, this is going to be the name of our plugin, and it's going to be what you call when you do this. So if I wanted to make another one for yellow, I would just say yellow, and then give it a function to look at, or a method. So anyway, let's see, I'm not going to do a yellow one for now though. So blue is going to call isBlue. That's the function that's going to be called right here. So at this point, I could just say return true, I believe. Is that? Let's save that and save this. And I think this should work. If not, I probably did something wrong. So let's see, that worked. But the problem is if I say red, that's going to work. So we're making this, yeah, so that's going to work too, which is obviously wrong. So we need to add some logic here that says when I am given a string, whenever my color choice variable is passed to my function, I need to do a little bit of work to it to see if it's a form of blue or not. So I'll write that really quick. I'm going to say blue values. I'm going to give a list of different valid values that blue could be. One of them is blue. That obviously should work. Another one is OOOOFF. That should work. OOF. That should work. You can also represent it as RGB in CSS. So I'm going to say 00255. And you can also do RGBA, but I'm not going to put that one in because I'm lazy. RGB, you can also do percent values, so 0%, 0%, 100%. And there's probably a library somewhere in the world that actually does more validations for this, but I don't want to make this test plugin really, really long and complicated because it's not even meant to illustrate all of Ansible's Python capabilities. It's more meant to demonstrate how to put a plugin into a collection. So I'll say if the string that I'm given is in blue values, which is this list right here, then return true. If it's not, return false. And so now if I have red, which I believe I still have, yeah, so my color choice is currently red, this should return a fail, which it does. No test name blue. What happened there? There's blue is blue. Did I have a syntax error down here somewhere? Let's see. That looks like it should be correct. No test name blue. Why is it not picking this up in test plugins? Oh, skipping. Oh, there's a invalid syntax on line 13. What did I do? Oh, else. I think I just need a colon there. Yep. So here's my my brain working in C, PHP, and Python together always ends up missing a little colon or something like that in my syntax. And thanks, Jose, for noticing that. So now we have a plugin that's working for this, and if I change this back to blue, it should work. So let's try that. And if I change it to one of these values, like the RGB value for it, that should also work. And obviously this is not the most intelligent test in the world, but it gets the point across that you can have some logic that tests something in your Ansible playbook, and and cleans up all that logic that could have been inside this playbook. So we have a plugin here, and let's say that we have this plugin, and there's also a role that we built that is going to template a web page and put this blue color in as the background for it or something like that. It'd be nice if we could package that together and then ship everything together. And you could technically do that with roles. A role on Ansible Galaxy can have a libraries folder, and that libraries folder can have plugins and modules in it. But there's a couple problems with that. One is there's no way to list what's in that role in terms of plugins and modules, so you kind of have to know that things are in there, and you can't search for it on Galaxy, and it can't be documented automatically, that kind of thing. So Ansible Collections offers a lot of those, a lot of the functionality that you want. Let's see. Let me also make sure I'm not missing any of my wonderful notes that I wrote to help me make sure I didn't miss anything like that colon that I just missed. And let me skip over the history because I already talked about the history. Might actually want to change the order in my book too. We'll see. All right, so we want to put together a new collection that this plugin can live inside, and then we could also eventually, if we wanted to, distribute on an Ansible Galaxy. And it looks like Hans is saying how many things are still Python 2. There's very little in Ansible now that's still stuck in Python 2 land. Everything that I've used in the past year has worked on Python 3. I don't have Python 2 installed anywhere anymore, so I don't think you'll have an issue there. There might be some old modules that still have issues, but I haven't encountered them recently. Anyway, let's see. So what we want to do is create a collection for this. And the collection can have plugins, and it can have roles, and it can have modules. And we're just going to put this one plugin to it, but this will show you kind of the structure of collections, where they are, how you call them from your playbook and all that. And so what we need to do is Ansible automatically looks for a test plugins directory for test plugins. It looks for a filter plugins for filter plugins. It looks for roles inside of a roles directory, and it looks for collections inside a collections directory. So I'm going to create a directory called collections, and there it is. And then Ansible is going to look inside this folder for any local collections that we might have created. And to create a collection, it's the same thing as with Ansible Galaxy to create a role. So if you say Ansible Galaxy role init and then give it a role name, it'll create a role. Similarly, we can create a collection with collection, and let me move this up in case somebody pauses this and the playhead covers it. Collection init, and one thing that you have to keep in mind with collections is that they are a little bit different than roles, in that you have to have a namespace. And you might wonder why. It's because Ansible uses a Python, I think it's PEP 420 or something. It uses the Python namespace-based autoloader to load collection code. And because of that, you have to have it in a certain folder using a certain pattern. Otherwise, Ansible's playbook or Ansible's code can't pick up all the code in the collection. So when you create this, we have to use a namespace. Since this is a local collection, I'm just going to call it local.colors. So this collection has to do with colors. I might have roles and modules that have to do with colors for my web app. So I'm going to do this. And then the other thing that you have to do, and this is a little confusing, especially when you're starting out with collections, and it's again because of this namespace loader, you have to create things in the right path for Ansible to see it. Otherwise, Ansible is going to be like, I don't see your collection. Whereas with roles, you can just name a role anything and throw it in the roles directory. With collections, you have to have it in the right path. Otherwise, the collection loader won't see it. So I'm going to give it, let's see, I am on the wrong page in my book. You have to give it a flag called init path like that. And then I'm going to say inside the collections folder that I just created, /Ansible collections. So if I do that, it's going to create a collection for me in here. And this is, this might, if you're familiar with like Java or even PHP, a lot of projects are doing it this way now. There's a lot of empty directories here, and that's just necessary for Ansible's new collection loader to load all the code correctly. So you kind of just have to live with it. But the collections all live in here, and then they have to be inside an Ansible collection so that Ansible can have its like global namespace to load these things. And then you have your namespace for the collection, which is local. And then finally you have the collection, which is colors. And inside colors, this is actually the collection itself. It comes out of the box with a few folders, docs, plugins, and roles, and then a galaxy.yaml file. The most important thing in a collection, and really the only thing that's required, you could have an empty collection if you want, is a galaxy file. And the first few things are necessary. The rest of this stuff is optional but strongly recommended. None of these things really have to be filled out if you don't want to for a local collection. They're only really important if you need to put a collection on Ansible Galaxy. So you can leave the version the same forever if you want, if this is just local. But you do have to have a version in your galaxy.yaml for a collection. So I'm just going to remove all this stuff that I don't need for this local collection. Right there, and delete all that. So this is all that you really need for a collection to be usable locally. And then right now the plugins directory, docs, these are all empty, and I don't have any roles yet, so I'm just going to delete that folder. And I don't have any docs. It's probably a good idea to write some docs, but I don't have any for this particular example. And then plugins has a README that says how to use this directory. So instead of having a folder called test_plugins in my playbook, in the plugins directory, I just create a folder for the type of plugin. So I have a test plugin, so I'll create a test folder. So I'm going to do that, new folder, test. So now I have a test folder in there, and I want to move this blue.py into that test folder. I wish you could drag and drop inside of Sublime, but I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reveal this folder in the Finder, and then I'm just going to drag it and use spring-loaded folders or whatever this feature is called to pop it in there. Plugins, and drop it into test. All right, so it's in there now, and it's not in the test plugins directory. So I'm going to delete that folder. Now, if I run this playbook, there's going to be a problem. I'm going to, whoops, I already did that. Let me clear this. I'm going to run the playbook again, and it's going to tell me that it can't find the blue test anymore. And that's because there is a plugin down in here called blue.py, and it should be picked up in this collection, and Ansible will automatically scan for collections in the collections folder. But you can't refer to it the same way as you did when it was kind of what I call a bear plugin. Not like a bear that roars and goes, "Arr," but a bear like B-A-R-E, a plugin that's just in your playbook directly. With collections, you have to refer to plugins. Let me make sure I get the terminology right because I always say the wrong thing. With collections, you have to use the fully qualified collection name, or you'll see it in the documentation sometimes referred to as FQCN. And that is basically the namespace, which is local, and then the collection name, which is colors, and then the actual plugin itself, which is blue. And those are all separated by a dot. So if I say local.colors.blue, and I rerun this, I believe that should work, unless again, okay, so it did. It picked that up. And again, the reason for that is Ansible for collections is using Python's built-in namespace autoloader. I forget what it's like PEP 420 or PEP 4 something. Anyway, if you want to read all about that, you can. You don't have to know how the autoloader works, but you do have to know that for a collection to work, it has to be in a folder structure that starts with Ansible_collections, then has your namespace folder, then has your collection folder, and then has all the different plugins and roles and modules and things. So that's when you're starting out with collections. I think that's the thing that's been tripping me up the most, especially since I'm used to the simplicity with a role where you have a role and you can name it anything you want. You don't have to worry about namespaces, and you don't have to worry about FQCNs and things like that. With collections, you always have to, no matter what. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to build a collection. And if you're going to put it on Ansible Galaxy, there's some other things to keep in mind too. Not only should you fill out this whole galaxy.yaml file, you can't just have a GitHub repository and throw it up on Ansible Galaxy. You have to build your collection, and there's a tool, Ansible Ansible Galaxy collection build, I think it is, that can build a version of the collection as a tarball, and then you upload that tarball using Ansible Galaxy collection push, or I forget, publish, I think it is. And that publishes onto Ansible Galaxy. Or if you have a private Ansible Galaxy, which I think is some feature that might be coming soon, then you could push it there too. And you can actually have multiple Ansible Galaxies that you can pull things from. So those are all things to keep in mind. And I was going to, in this episode, try to talk through all of that process. But instead, I would recommend that the hard thing is that because a lot of this is new-ish, so Ansible 2.8 was the first time that Ansible collections themselves were a thing. In Ansible 2.9, collections were kind of refined to the point where they were more useful and could be worked with. Ansible 2.10 is not actually released yet, but it has a ton of little improvements to the collection user experience. Like, if I wanted to show you some of the things I want to show you, I would have to caveat a lot of things and say, like, this is how it works now, but in Ansible 2.10 it'll change. I don't want to have to do that in this video because I'm trying to make this series be a little more timeless and apply for a little longer period of time. But I will talk about a couple things in particular. If you go to Ansible Galaxy, there are already some collections on there. There's most of the collections that are parts of Ansible core. Let me sort this by download count just to show some of those. So the Kubernetes collection has the Kubernetes modules that were taken out of Ansible core 2.9 and put into this collection, and then they'll be in the Ansible distribution in 2.10, but they're not part of Ansible's devel branch. They're not on GitHub anymore in Ansible. They're separately maintained in the Kubernetes collection. Similarly, there's NetCommon has common networking modules that are used by all the different networking systems. There's a cloud, it's Google Cloud. It's kind of funny because it's like, oh, cloud, and then you're like, oh, it's Google Cloud. So you might see like 5 cloud collections, but one of them is Google's, one of them is Amazon's. So collections on Galaxy, the usability of discovering them and also vetting which ones are the appropriate one for you to use. Some of that's also being worked out right now, and that's another thing. That's another reason why this collections episode is more towards the end of this series, and not at the beginning. At the beginning, this would have been even harder to do because some of the little things that I've been doing would have worked differently 2 or 3 months ago, or I wouldn't have been able to explain it that well because some of the things that I would be explaining were things that I still didn't understand myself. But let's say you wanted to use the Kubernetes collection. You can do it the same way. Let me see here. I'm going to create a new file, a requirements.yaml file. Save this as requirements.yaml. And in here, I'm going to say collections, and this is all based on memory. I haven't finished this part of the book yet, so I think it's like name community.kubernetes and version. We'll do 0.11.0. And if I say Ansible Galaxy install, what this is going to do is this will install this collection by default. It won't install it playbook local, even though it'll pick up collections playbook local like this. It will install it by default into not a global path, but a path that could be shared with other playbooks. I don't really like sharing collections between playbooks because, especially with Kubernetes, one playbook I might have written with Kubernetes 0.10.0, and I don't know if it's going to work with 11.0 yet. So I'm going to, I want to make sure that those playbooks are different these collections are the version that I specified per playbook. And because of that, I want to install it locally. So what I do a lot of times is I say, add an Ansible, Ansible.cfg file to tell Ansible some configuration defaults to override. So I'm going to say defaults collections paths, and then I'm going to put that equal to collections. And what that's going to do is tell Ansible Galaxy, when you install collections, install them into this folder. So instead of installing this Kubernetes collection into my more global user path or into user local or user share, wherever it installs more globally, it's going to install it local to this collection. or local to my Ansible playbook. So I'm going to say Ansible Galaxy install -r requirements. And oh, this is another thing about collections. So I think this might be fixed in Ansible 2.10. Notice that I just did this by muscle memory. I wanted to install all the requirements, so I ran this command and nothing happened. That's because Ansible Galaxy install currently requires you in Ansible 2.9 to do role install, and it defaults to role install, but it didn't see any roles in here, so there's just a collection. There's no roles. So it kind of just did nothing, and that's it. I opened an issue for this saying this is basically a bug because I had no idea that nothing happened, and there's no, if I say echo the exit, it was successful. So I would imagine that it installed that, but it didn't. In Ansible 2.9, you have to say Ansible Galaxy Collection install, and that is, I haven't hit enter. There we go. And that is actually going to install the Kubernetes collection. And so if I look in here, now there's a new namespace in my collections folder, community Kubernetes. And so I could start using that Kubernetes collection. So as I mentioned, this is why this is way later in the series. I wanted to make sure I had a full understanding of how all this works before I fumbled over it all live on a live stream. And in Ansible 2.10, some of these things like this, I believe, works in 2.10. It will basically install all the roles and all the collections without you having to run one command and then run another command later. And like I said, I like to have my collections in the playbook, installed in the playbook. And then you can also make the decision if you want, like let's say you're using Ansible Tower, you can say, I want the collections to be in the source with my repository, and I'll manage them on my machine. I don't want Tower to reinstall them every time because some collections have a lot of dependencies. And what happens if you install like Community General and some of the other big collections, it can take a minute or two to install all the collections that you might depend on for a big playbook. So because of that, what I usually do is I commit all of the dependencies to the repository, and then I just have automation that updates them whenever I change my requirements file and update a version or something like that. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to cover really quick here? Another cool thing about collections versus roles is on Ansible Galaxy, what happens is you build an artifact of a collection, and Galaxy hosts that artifact, and that artifact, that tarball for each version, doesn't ever change. And with Ansible roles, what I could have done if I was malicious and didn't like you, and you used one of my roles, is I could have changed the contents of one of the older versions of my role that you might be using, and it would change, like you would install it and it would work great, but then I could change it later because it was pulling it from GitHub, and on GitHub you can change tags and what's inside of a tag. So I could have done that, and that could have caused problems for you. With this, Ansible is actually hosting the collection that you're downloading and all the content that's inside of it. And that also helps with the potential for something, I think it was LeftPad in Node.js, or with that chef issue. If I were to delete my collection off of GitHub entirely, you could still install it because the artifact, the thing that was released as version 0.11.0, that's hosted on Ansible Galaxy. So that's a cool feature of Ansible Galaxy, and it's also all powered through a backend called Pulp. And Pulp is like a Python dependency managing packaging system thing. And because of that, there are some other features that are a lot easier to have a path to implementation, like upgrading your dependencies and uninstalling and reinstalling and doing things like that we couldn't really do as much with roles on Ansible Galaxy. So there's a lot of cool potential future growth, and there's a lot of things. If you go to the Ansible's repository or Galaxy's repository and you filter by author geerlingguy, you'll notice that all these little things where I'm like, oh, we could do this, oh, we could do that. There's a lot of those kind of things out there, and I'm excited about it. I think it's going to take a little time because the move of all of Ansible's modules and content, basically taking all the batteries that are included inside of Ansible, pulling them out of Ansible and putting them elsewhere, and then building a new system to pull the batteries back in for when you install Ansible. That's been a lot of work, and that's, it's hard to polish things when you're also trying to make a lot of foundational changes at the same time. If you've ever done any building projects, you realize when you need to work on the foundation of a building, usually you create a very huge mess, and you have to rip off a lot of siding and a lot of the nice stuff that looks nice on the house. And then afterwards, after all of it's done, and after the foundation is nice and strong and set again, then you can start working on patching up everything and making it look nice again. I think we're at that stage at this point with collections. And again, another reason why I didn't want to try to cover collections earlier in this series. And I probably will talk more about collections in the future, even outside of the Ansible 101 series. Just because there's a lot more to them, and they can help. Somebody mentioned from a security perspective too. There's a lot of security benefits to the way that collections work, and the ability to also download them like this offline and put them onto servers without an internet connection, that kind of thing. Those things are a lot easier to do with collections than they were with roles. Anyway. Let's see, collections, the new NPM. Yeah, the hardest thing with all these things, it's dependency management is so hard. It's hard to do it right, and then it's way harder to do it right and make it usable. And there's always a lot of trade-offs to make, performance versus security versus usability. And I've never met a dependency manager for any language that I'm like, man, I just love this. There's nothing bad about it. There's always going to be something difficult or something that's not implemented as well as it could be, or something that's slower than you want. I think with collections, the thing that bugs me the most is just the fact that you have all these extra empty directories. It's like if I want to get to actual code, it's in one of my collections. I have to open collections, Ansible collections, 2 empty folders so far, a 3rd empty folder, which is the namespace, and then finally I have the collection, which is here. And then inside of it, I can get to the plugins and things. So I get why it's done. It's a little, I don't know, it's slightly abrasive to me, because that feels more like programming, where you have namespaces and things like that that are required for everything, even if it's local. So what I've done a lot of times is, for my playbooks, I still have roles that are local to a playbook in a roles directory, and plugins that are in a test plugins or in filter plugins. I still have them local to the playbook if it's just for one playbook. I don't usually use collections for that, just because I don't want to have to deal with the folder hierarchy. You could do it either way. The other thing is that in the playbook itself, you don't have to use the FQCN. If it's a local playbook plugin, I can just call it blue, and it's a little more semantic for me. Another quick note on that before we go, you can, it doesn't work for test plugins, but if it were roles, so let's say we had a role in that collection. So we said roles, local.colors.make me a color or something like that. And that was the role name. You can add a keyword up here, collections, and say local.colors. And then in your playbook, you don't have to refer to the collection, the fully qualified collection name. Ansible will automatically alias the error. It'll look for this role inside this collection. But that carries with it its own caveats and its own set of potential downsides, especially if you have two collections that define the same role, which can happen, like an installer role. So there's a lot that still needs to be hashed out a little bit, and best practices that will be made. And hopefully everybody watching this can help make some of those best practices happen too. Let's see. Any good questions really quick before I wrap it up? Commit hooks. Someone actually posted in comments on YouTube about a commit hook for linting Ansible. I saw some stuff on Twitter too. You can look that up on Google. But you can have a commit hook that will lint your Ansible playbooks. Binging playbook done with Molecule, cool, very cool. First time on live episodes, welcome, very welcome. We're glad to have you, Matai or Matty. test verifier. So I haven't talked about Ansible test. Ansible test is a tool, and that is Ansible test like that. Or I could just do it here. Ansible test is a tool for testing Ansible collections and Ansible content, and it's used by Ansible core as well. It's similar to Molecule in some ways, but it's also a little more. It's a little more for the Python side of testing. But I would look that up online. I actually have a blog post about testing collections with Ansible test. You can test collections with Molecule as well, and I have a blog post on that on jeffgeerling.com. Anyways, if I didn't get to your question, I always glance back at live chat, so I'll try to get to it next episode. You can follow me and consider supporting me on GitHub or Patreon if any of this stuff helps you. Thank you very much for that. You can follow me on Twitter, which is over there. I'm Geerling Guy most places. Ansible Galaxy, pretty much everywhere. And thank you so much for watching. I'm glad I was able to do this. I was very close to canceling, and that would have been the first week in, I don't know, 3 months that I wouldn't have done a live stream. I don't know what I would have done with myself. But anyway, thanks for watching. I will see you next week. Next week I'm going to see if this is going to work. It could fail spectacularly, so please tune in to watch. It'll be exciting one way or the other. I'm going to see if I can talk about Ansible on Windows, and I'm going to use a Windows laptop to do it. I'm not going to live stream from it. I think I'm going to try to get the Windows laptop into my Mac and then stream from the Mac while I'm doing the work on Windows, so that, because the Windows laptop's a little bit older. But we're going to talk about that and see how far we can go. Talk about Windows subsystem for Linux, talk about the Windows modules for Ansible, all those different things. So please tune back in next week, and thank you for watching these Ansible 101 series. I hope that you're having a great day.